Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We just have a few more people joining us in the waiting room, and we'll get started shortly. Okay, wonderful. So I'm going to go over the virtual meeting guidelines. My name's Kate White. I'm the Public Outreach Coordinator for the MPO. We just have a couple guidelines for our open house. So all participants are joining with muted microphones. If you haven't already done so, which it looks like everyone has, please rename yourself to include your first and last name. This will help us when we call on you when you have a question. Please do not unmute or mute yourself. To participate in the discussion, please select the raise hand function. This is the button at the bottom of your screen. If you click on participants, you can see it there. The window will pop up and with the raise hand button at the bottom. And the presenters will then call on participants and unmute the microphone. If you're on a phone, you can use the *9, and this will then help you raise your hand. If you have any technical difficulties at all throughout the presentation in the open house, you can contact Roisin Foley via the chat box, her email foley@c2s.org, or give her a call at 857-702-3704.
Hi guys.
And so on the call today, we have 5 of our MPO staff members joining to help. And so we have Matt Archer, our transportation planner, Jonathan Church, the MPO Activities Group Manager, as already mentioned, Roisin Foley, our communications associate, Matt Genova, our tip manager, who will be presenting today, and then again, myself, the public outreach coordinator. Before we dive into all the material, we want to tell you a little bit about some upcoming MPO virtual events we have. On Tuesday, May 12th, we'll be hosting a forum with MAPC for transportation providers to discuss their COVID-19 response. We'll also be hosting a second tip virtual open house. So if you want to get more information that you didn't get to today, you can always sign up for that on Monday, May 18th at noon. And we'll also be hosting a virtual open house with MassDOT to talk about their CIP. And this will be on Thursday, May 21st at 6 p.m. You're also welcome to join us for any of our MPO meetings. We're hosting all of these virtually, and you can find them on our meeting calendar. We'll send all this information to you in a post-event email afterwards. So with that, I want to introduce my colleague, Matt Genova, our tip manager, who will be presenting today about the federal fiscal year 2021 to 2025 tip. Oh, and to highlight, if you want to reach out to us at any time, you can always visit our website at bostonmpo.org, and you can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Boston Region MPO. You can also check out any of our meetings and event videos at our YouTube channel, which is also at Boston Region MPO. So with that, Matt.
Awesome, thanks Kate, and thanks everyone for taking the time to join us today. My name is Matt Genova, and as Kate mentioned, I'm the Transportation Improvement Program Manager here for the Boston Region MPO. So the focus of today's conversation is really to highlight the contents of the federal fiscal years 2021 through 25 TIP, Transportation Improvement Program here in the Boston region. So the TIP contains all of the capital investments made in the region using federal transportation dollars, includes everything from transit projects and rail trails to highway pavement projects and complete streets. So we've got quite a bit of ground to cover today, but hopefully what we've put together for you will help make not only the TIP, but also the work of the MPO accessible and digestible and comprehensible here. So I guess to sort of get everyone warmed up and to practice our raise hand function here in the Zoom platform, and sort of get a sense of who's in the room. Can folks just click the raise hand button if they're familiar with the MPO, the work of the Boston MPO, sort of before today's talk. So if you guys want to raise your hands, see if anyone is familiar with us. Got a few hands popping up. Awesome. Cool, yeah, and then you can use the unraised hand to put those down. And then second question here, is anyone already familiar with the Transportation Improvement Program and sort of what it is and what it does? See a hand or two popping up here, which is great. So, I mean, we're going to be pretty comprehensive today. So hopefully we can, make clear sort of where we're coming from as an agency, and then also sort of what we do through the Transportation Improvement Program. So let's dive in. Our goals for this presentation are really threefold. The first is to give you an overview of the MPO and our role here in the region. The second is really to outline the allocation of federal transportation funding to capital projects in the region for fiscal years 2021 through 2025, which is the contents of this year's tip. And then the third and final goal here is to really have a discussion with you all to answer your questions or address your comments or concerns about this year's tip or any other sort of MPO related things that you'd like to ask about. So let's start with some background on who we are and the role we play in allocating federal transportation funds in the Boston region. So if you are in a municipality in a federally defined urbanized area, which is called a UZA, with a population of more than 50,000 people, then you're part of an MPO. And so MPOs blanket a big portion of the United States. And the funding for the operations of an MPO, as well as the capital money for MPOs, comes from a combination of federal transportation funds, and then the required matching funds from state and local governments. And here in the Commonwealth, the Commonwealth itself, Massachusetts, provides the matching funds. So MPOs are tasked with a couple of different things. The first is to really develop a vision for multimodal transportation in the region. And that's done through our long-range transportation plan, which is the 20-year vision and goals for our transportation system. The second is really to distribute federal funds to construction projects that support the region. And that's done through the Transportation Improvement Program, which will obviously be the focus of today's discussion. And the TIP is a 5-year rolling capital investment plan. And by rolling, we sort of mean that each year, a new year sort of comes off the front and those projects actually go to construction, and then a new year is added on the back end. In this case, 2020 has come off from last year's TIP, and then 2025 is being added in. And those investments help us really realize the goals set out in the long-range plan. And then finally, the third sort of big duty of the MPO is to carry out multimodal transportation planning and studies across the region. And the outcomes of those studies, which we do through our Unified Planning Work program, really serve to inform our future investment choices. So the Boston Region MPO is one of 13 MPOs in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So the federal government gives roughly $600 million in highway funding to the state annually for constructing multimodal transportation projects. And then of that money, the state allocates about 40%, or roughly $250 million to all of the state's MPOs. And then there's another $14 million that's allocated for planning. And again, that's done through our Unified Planning Work program, which I mentioned on the last slide. So that $250 million then gets divided up among the MPOs across the Commonwealth. And the Boston region really gets the sort of plurality of that funding, roughly 43% of the funds across the whole state. This is because the allocation of MPO funds across the state takes into account things like population, roadway miles, and number of jobs relative to the statewide whole. Boston has, roughly 34% of the road lane miles in the Commonwealth, roughly half of all the jobs in the Commonwealth, and then almost half of the population. So, that's about 3 million people and more than 2 million jobs. And so that's where, we end up getting about 43% of the statewide funding for MPOs. There's a lot of other funding, which I'll get to here in a second. So it's not just MPO funds that are in the TIP, but also funds that are prioritized by some of our partners at the state DOT, as well as at the regional transit authorities, the MBTA, CATA, and Metro West RTA. So I'll talk later in the presentation about the money allocated to those entities and sort of how it is distributed across projects in the region. And I do want to say, as you can see from this map here, that the MPO is really a pretty diverse place. There are 97 cities and towns in the Boston region, and communities range from relatively rural towns such as Dover to large urban centers such as Boston or Cambridge. So we really, as a regional body, have to take into account the demographic, cultural, and environmental diversity of the region, and try to do our best to help all towns meet their goals. So who is really on the MPO board? Like, who's making the decisions that we'll be talking about today? So we have 22 voting members on the board. We'll start by mentioning the chair of our board, which is the Massachusetts Department of Transportation. This is a little bit unique for MPOs around the country. Most state DOTs don't chair MPOs, but here in the Commonwealth, because the state provides the 20% match to federal funding, they sit as the chair of each MPO board. And they're accompanied by state partners, including the MBTA and Massport. So there are 5 total state representatives across those 3 agencies who are on our board. Let's see. Sorry. Losing my click. Okay. So we also have 12 elected municipalities who sit on our board. There are 4 at-large towns, which you see highlighted in blue here. And then there are 8 sub-regional representatives, which you see highlighted in gold. And so our region is broken out into these 8 sub-regions, which help sort of create more focus groups around slightly more local needs. And then each of those sub-regions has a seat on our board. The city of Boston has 2 seats on our board. And then we have 3 sort of regional advisory bodies that also have seats on our board. The Regional Transportation Advisory Council is our sort of in-house advisory board, and they help bring the voices of other, interested transportation parties to bear on the MPO's decision-making. We also have a seat for the MBTA's advisory board, which performs a similar function for the MBTA in their service region. And then finally, a seat for the Metropolitan Area Planning Council. And MAPC, I'm sure many of you are familiar with their work, but they are our sister agency and also the regional planning agency for the Boston region. And so they sit as our vice chair. So that sort of who's making the decisions that we'll be talking about today. So why should you care about MPOs? So MPOs, beyond the fact that I just mentioned, which, MPOs allocate federal transportation dollars in the region, which is certainly an important role. But MPOs also, in addition to just allocating funds, are really working to solve the kinds of transportation challenges that are at the forefront of the Boston region's policy discussions. So if you've picked up a copy of the Globe in the last year or two, you've surely seen a lot of the things on this slide covered, things like congestion, obviously, that's been a hot topic over the last several months, but also things like, economic development and, health, air quality, the way that those things interact with bigger picture issues like climate change. Those are all things that we're thinking about and working on. And we also do that, with an eye towards equity in our region. So making sure that everyone, regardless of age, gender, race, income, ability, or language, has access to our transportation system and can use that system to get to the services and jobs that they need to be successful. And then finally, another big topic of conversation here in the region over the last several months are things like economic development and affordable housing. And so we do, jointly with our sister agency and MAPC, think about the intersection between transportation and land use in the region. So I'm gonna spend the next couple of minutes just going over a bit of history. So the former college history major in me really enjoys this part of the presentation, and I think it really helps to frame the investment choices that we've made, not only in this 5-year TIP, but also just more generally in how we set our vision for the region. So hopefully this is sort of edifying history for those who may not be as familiar with it. So MPOs were created in large part as a reaction to the 1950s era of highway building, both here in the region and nationally. So the story really begins in 1948 when the state developed its first highway master plan. So at this time, the federal government funded a large percentage of road building costs, but planning for these projects was carried out by states. That planning was limited really to technical issues rather than social or land use considerations. And so it was really more about, moving vehicles through communities to and from their end destinations rather than, taking into account the impacts of that transportation system on the communities in which that system runs through. Let's see, sorry. For example, here are some of the plans for an interchange that thankfully did not happen, that would have been right on top of existing neighborhoods in Somerville and Cambridge. Here it's obvious that communities would have been completely razed, through Central Square and Union Square, sort of vibrant neighborhoods in modern day Cambridge and Somerville. And so, we're lucky that this sort of era of highway building didn't continue at its then current pace. And as someone who just recently lived in mid-Cambridge, I'm especially thankful that this particular project did not happen. Sorry, lots of clicks here. So really amid controversy around some of these large scale, potentially neighborhood destroying projects, in 1962, the Federal Aid Highway Act mandated that any projects that receive federal funds, such as the highways in this plan, could not be approved in urban areas unless they were based on a continuing comprehensive transportation planning process carried out cooperatively by states and local communities. So states and urban areas responded by creating sort of ad hoc committees or formalizing the role of existing advisory councils around transportation planning. And these sort of committees in their infancy really became the nexus for what would become MPOs. Even though these advisory councils started to pop up, controversy continued, and really from the late 1950s through about 1970, in the Boston region and around the country, there were a lot of what are known as the highway revolts, which really challenged this longtime conventional practice of highway planning that largely, ran projects through communities. And as political support grew for some of these, pushback movements against new highway building, sort of major politicians began lending their voice to charting forward a new way. So in 1970, not long after becoming governor, Francis Sargent put a moratorium on highway building inside of Route 128 and called for a comprehensive multimodal study of the region's transportation needs. So this resulted in stops to construction, leaving things like this ramp here in Somerville that really show sort of what could have become, but what ended up not happening. So really, a lot of what Governor Sargent talked about at that time was just that we can't sort of build our way out of congestion for those who keep close track of the sort of language that we use around planning in today's time. A lot of these views are echoed still today, that just building more highways leads to more congestion and more vehicle miles traveled. And so in 1973, we finally get the creation of MPOs, which were given the power to not only coordinate sort of a better way for transportation planning in the region, but also to actually allocate the funds to do that. And those funds, again, come from the federal government. So that's where sort of like the few minute overview of how we got to where we are today and sort of the framework in which we think about making investments. And from here, I want to talk a little bit more about the specific role of the MPO in a more concrete way, rather than in such a big picture way, before we get into the actual investments that we're making. So given the sort of fairly singular focus of federal transportation investments historically, the MPO's role is to really foster a transportation system that supports, again, sort of a new way of thinking about this, or what was then a new way in the 1970s, but still is very much the way that we think about it today, which is really in more of a multifaceted approach. So, things like sustainability, public health, quality of life, and economic vitality all come into play as we're thinking about making investments in the region. And in making those investments, we also want to make sure that everyone can benefit from it equitably. And so what does this really mean? Note the sort of last word on this slide here, options. So our goal is really to provide sort of all people in the region abundant transportation options, so that folks aren't sort of trapped in sort of a singular mode of travel, but that people have several different choices for getting around in their everyday needs. So how do we make this vision happen? The traditional sort of highway engineering approach to this problem would think about addressing congestion through adjusting signal timing or making improvements to intersections, or other sort of design or technology changes to move vehicles faster. But of course, we know that alone is not going to solve our problems. And so when we make investments, we think about sort of the broader range of other things that we can do to provide a safe and comfortable transportation system. So, one option there is to provide safe and comfortable facilities for people who want to bike and improve connections within the bicycle network. We can also do things like improve the environment for people walking to expand connections in the pedestrian network and improve the safety and convenience of pedestrian crossings. We can also improve ADA accessibility for people with disabilities that otherwise would have trouble navigating the transportation system. And because on the roadway, public transit or high occupancy trips are really the most efficient and safest way to move people around. We also work to reduce delay and improve the reliability of buses, so that it's possible to run more frequent service with the same resources and make it more attractive to people who are looking for alternate transportation modes. We also want to provide safe, convenient access to transit, and encourage folks to use these resources to get around the region. And we also think about things like climate vulnerability and resilience, and how we can use our investments to do things like, expand the tree canopy coverage to prevent the urban heat island effect, or, to increase pervious surfaces and prevent stormwater runoff issues. And finally, we sort of link all of these transportation improvements to the way we think about economic vitality goals for the region, which is really about connecting people to the jobs and services they need to be successful. But the range of things that we think about is core to our work. This is really a very specific term when it comes to the transportation space. And we really do have a mandate as an agency to think about how transportation has impacted historically disadvantaged populations, and how we can tailor our investments, our outreach, and our planning to make sure that we're meeting the needs of those specific populations in full. And so, it's really about thinking, about the range of people who are impacted by our transportation system and who are also protected by federal legislation, and how we can tailor our work, not just in our planning work, but also in the investments that we're making in capital projects in the region, so that everyone has equal access and isn't unduly burdened by our system. To put sort of all these principles of multimodality and equity into action, we really do three core things as an MPO. The first, as I mentioned earlier, is to create a framework for making investments, which is defining the vision for transportation in the region. The second, which we'll be talking about today, and we're getting into sort of the specifics of how we allocate funds here in just a minute, which is through our transportation improvement program. And it's really about how we allocate funds to meet the needs that we define in our long-range plan. And then finally, again, studying and analyzing the investments we make and, understanding ways that we can improve those investments and help municipalities and transit agencies achieve their goals. So all these things together really, make up the core of the work of the MPO. So getting into the framework that we use to actually make our investments. So the framework that we use are what we call our investment programs. And these programs are actually established through our long-range plan. And our most recent long-range plan, Destination 2040, was endorsed by our board in August of 2019, so a little bit less than a year ago. And really, these investment programs guide the decision-making of the board as we choose projects to fund. In addition to helping municipalities in the region understand, what the priorities of the MPO are and the types of projects that will actually, help them fund with our dollars. And so I should say here that I mentioned earlier, and we'll come back to this idea that the actual funds that the MPO allocates is just sort of one bucket of funding among multiple in the region. And so these investment programs are really for the MPO specific funds that the board, our MPO board, has direct decision-making power over. And so you see this breakdown here. This is how we aim to distribute the funds across investment programs in our region. So we look to spend a plurality of our funding on complete streets projects. Again, going back to those multimodal goals that I talked about earlier. We aim to spend no more than 30% of our funding on major infrastructure projects. And these are larger scale projects that either cost more than $20 million or add capacity to our transportation system. We also aim to spend about 13% of our funding on intersection improvements that are largely focused on enhancing safety at intersections. And then you see some of the smaller investment programs that we have, though certainly still core to our work. Our bicycle and pedestrian program, which we aim to spend about 5% of our funding on. Our transit modernization program, which also is actually new this year and is something that we also aim to dedicate about 5% of our funds to. And then our community connections program, which is our first and last mile funding program that we allocate about 2% of our funding to. So I'll go into a little bit more detail about the projects that are funded through these programs here in just a minute. So as I mentioned a few times, but I really want to sort of put a point on, the tip is really about federal funds in the region. And so, again, this refers to not only MPO prioritized money, but also to the funds prioritized by our partners at the State Department of Transportation, as well as federal funds prioritized by the regional transit agencies, the MBTA, MWRTA, and CATA. And I do just want to highlight here, just to make sure that we're all on the same page. So what's funded through the TIP, again, is really the federal portion of transportation money in the region. But there are obviously lots of other ways that transportation projects can be funded via non-federal funds. So the State Department of Transportation has roadway funding that it allocates using state resources. And this is separate from the state matching funds that match federal dollars. So these are purely state funded projects. There's also state allocated money in the state budget for the MBTA that they use for capital projects. And then the MBTA obviously generates its own revenue, some of which goes back into capital projects as well. And these sort of state-funded capital projects are really included in the Massachusetts Capital Investment Plan, which, as Kate mentioned earlier, we are co-hosting an information session on the Capital Investment Plan, or the CIP, with MassDOT here in a couple of weeks. So if you all are interested in more of the state level priorities, certainly join us for that. And then finally, there are other sources, things like municipal transportation dollars, public and private grants, and other sources of funding that can also come to bear on the transportation system as a whole. And none of those are included in the TIP. So let's get into how we actually allocated the funds in this year's TIP. And I'll go over sort of the TIP in a big picture way, and then I'll drill down to some of the specific decisions made with MPO prioritized funding. Give me just a sec to keep going here. So let's dive into really what's included. So this pie chart here really shows the overall picture for federal funding in the Boston region. So in total, roughly $4.5 billion in federal funding is allocated in our region. And this includes both the federal funds and then the state matching funds and some local matching funding in a few cases. And so this $4.5 billion is allocated over the full 5 years of the TIP, so federal fiscal years 2021 through 2025. So over the next few slides, I'll break down what this looks like for each agency in more detail. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to go into detail on every project funded by each agency because there are a couple hundred of projects. But I will sort of mention at a high level some projects to note that are being funded through this money. And then at the end, during the Q&A, if you have questions on specific projects, I'm happy to take those and try to answer them to the best of my ability with sort of off the cuff information. And if it's something that's more detailed that we can't answer today, we're always happy to follow up with you after this presentation if you're looking for specific project level information. So we'll start with MassDOT. So this is the federal funding that's prioritized by the state DOT. And you can see here that MassDOT has project categories, much like we do with our MPO prioritized funds as well. And so MassDOT funds everything from bicycle and pedestrian projects to interstate pavement repairs in their 5-year program. In total, MassDOT has 64 proposed projects in their 5-year program for a total cost of roughly $852 million. In their program, MassDOT funds, again, a broad range of projects. At a smaller scale, programs like the Safe Routes to Schools program are included in this big picture, as are bicycle and pedestrian projects, things like the Neponset River Greenway in Boston, and the Mass Central Rail Trail in Sudbury and Wayland. At a slightly larger scale, important safety and intersection projects are also funded by MassDOT, including things like the reconstruction of Broadway in Chelsea and the replacement of highway lighting on I-93 at the Braintree split. MassDOT also takes the lead in addressing bridge projects in the Commonwealth. This is obviously a big need, not only here in the Commonwealth, but nationally, and MassDOT really puts a significant amount of their resources. You can see here almost $300 million over 5 years into the bridge program. And some notable projects included in this 5-year plan include things like the North Washington Street Bridge in Boston and the Route 107 bridge over the Saugus River in Lynn and Saugus. And finally, large-scale highway projects are funded through MassDOT's program as well, including things like the reconstruction of the I-90 and 495 interchange in Hopkinton, and the rehabilitation of the Sumner Tunnel in Boston. Although actually that last project, Sumner Tunnel, is also partially funded using MPO dollars. So moving now to the MBTA. So roughly 2/3 of the federal funding that come to the T are what are called formula funds, which include everything under the banners of 5307, 5337, and 5339 on this slide. So the top several lines of this table. So this funding is distributed from the FTA to transit agencies around the country by formula, meaning that it often stays fairly consistent year to year and is based on things like, overall size of the service area of the agency, population, etc. So these formula funds are used to support many of the MBTA projects that you are probably familiar with. So things like the acquisition of new Green Line cars, new bi-level commuter rail coaches, things like improvements to signals on the red and orange lines, and improvements to stations and facilities like the Harvard Square busway or the Forest Hills T station. So in this chart here, the bottom two lines also detail significant non-formula funding for specific projects. So these projects include the Green Line extension, as well as positive train control. So the Green Line extension is funded using 5309 capital investment grants. So those are project-specific dollars that are just allocated to that. And I should note here that the Green Line extension, as many of you probably know, is nearing its completion. It is actually also funded in part using some MPO funds. So 2021, the first year of the TIP, is the final year of funding for that project, which I think everyone is very excited about seeing to completion. The other big project here, PTC, or Positive Train Control, is funded using what are called Railroad Rehabilitation and Improvement Financing dollars. And so that is a low-cost loan program through the US DOT, specific to that Positive Train Control project, which is a commuter rail safety project. So you can see there's quite a bit of funding devoted to that project over the 5 years of the TIP. But again, these are sort of non-recurring project-specific dollars that are not part of the MBTA's sort of year-to-year formula funds. So moving quickly into the other RTAs in the region, Cape Ann and Metro West. So you can see that their funding totals from the federal government are notably lower than the MBTA's, but they still cover the same sorts of projects, including things like the purchase of new buses, as well as improvements to transit stations like the Blandon Intermodal Terminal in Framingham. So CATA and MWRTA collectively have about $28 million in federal funding programmed over the 5 years of the TIP. So now that we've covered all of the federal programming from MassDOT and the regional transit authorities, I want to spend the last part of the presentation really diving into more detail on the regional target programming, which is the MPO specific dollars that are allocated in the 5 years of the TIP. So as I mentioned earlier, the MPO had roughly $538 million to allocate between federal fiscal years 2021 and 2025. So you can see here how that funding breaks down across the MPO's investment programs. You can see here that a plurality of our funding is dedicated to complete streets projects, with more than 45% of funds allotted to that investment program. So funded through our Complete Streets program are projects like the reconstruction of Essex Street in Lynn and the reconstruction of Route 3A in Hingham. Not far behind is our major infrastructure program, which has about 34% of our funding allocated to it. And projects funded in this program in the 5 years of the TIP include, as I mentioned before, some continued funding for the Green Line extension, as well as funding for the reconstruction of Rutherford Avenue in Boston. So next is intersection improvements with about 11.9% of our 5-year funding. And this includes projects like improvements at Route 1A in University Avenue in Norwood, as well as the rehabilitation of Kelly's Corner in Acton. The MPO has also programmed 5.7% of its funding to bicycle and pedestrian projects, including notable projects like the Bruce Freeman Rail Trail in Sudbury and the Minuteman Bikeway Extension in Bedford. And then 1.6% of the MPO's funding is allocated to our Community Connections program, which again funds first and last mile projects throughout the region. So I'll touch more on this program here in a minute, but this is a relatively new program that we are in the pilot round this year of funding for those projects. And I'll, again, come back to that in more detail in here in just a minute. But I also do want to note while we're on this slide that this tip cycle represents the first year that funding has been allocated to the MPO's Transit Modernization Program, which again was created last year in our long range plan. So right now, 1% of our funding is allocated to that program. And funding through this program will be dedicated to specific projects in future tip cycles. So this money right now is just sort of held for this program, but not actually allocated to specific projects yet. So it's really envisioned that this program will fund projects like improvements to commuter rail stations or accessibility enhancements to subway and light rail stations. So the MPO is working sort of over the next several months to continue to build out and scope this program. And so it's definitely one that we're all excited about. And that I know our board is really excited about because this opens up an avenue for us to allocate money to transit projects, not just in a one-off way, like we've done with the Green Line extension, but in really sort of a year-over-year way. And so we only have 1% of our funding allocated to that right now, which is about $5.5 million. But as we add subsequent years of funding in 2026 and beyond, we expect that that percentage will go up to closer to 5%, which is our target for that. And just finally of note, the MPO elected to leave 0.2% of our funding, or roughly $1.2 million unprogrammed, which gives us a very tiny bit of flexibility in coming years. So getting into the specifics a little bit more. So this table sort of breaks down the pie charts that I just went over. And you can see here that we funded 47 projects in the region using regional target dollars, or MPO funds. So nearly half of those projects are in our Complete Streets program. You can see 23 projects funded through there. And a few other things to note on this slide, again, is that we've only allocated 1 year of funding to specific projects through our Community Connections program. So there you see the second line in this table, the $822,000 that we've allocated to projects in that program. And then the line below, sort of like I was talking about earlier with the Transit Modernization Program, is money that's held in future years to be dedicated in future tip cycles to projects through that Community Connections program. So, you know, this is sort of a way of preserving that funding and saying, like, we recognize that the sort of turnaround time on smaller first and last mile projects is shorter for Community Connections. And so we're sort of holding that funding each year and then allocating it closer to sort of the actual fiscal year in which those projects happen. So again, in this year, we allocated funding for that just in 2021. And we'll be following that same sort of pattern with our Transit Modernization Program. So as I mentioned earlier, the MPO's long-range plan sets 5-year funding goals for each investment program. And I showed you that in the pie chart, a few slides ago. And so those goals are shown here on this slide in blue, and then in gold next to those are the actual allocations that are reflected in this year's 5-year tip. So you can see that our 5-year plan tracks fairly closely with our goals that we set out in our long-range plan. although we're slightly over-programmed on bicycle and pedestrian projects and slightly under-programmed on intersection improvements. And obviously, like, these things can fluctuate a little bit year to year, but this is sort of a snapshot in time of where we are this year. And again, you know, the transit modernization allocation here looks pretty small and is certainly below our goal, but that's because we've only allocated 1 year of funding to that program, and that will increase closer to the 5% goal as we add future years of funding. In the meantime, you can see that we're a little bit over-programmed on our major infrastructure category, and so some of that transit modernization money has sort of been shifted over there to cover needs in that program in the interim. So this is a quick reminder of how our region is broken down geographically into subregions. And so while the MPO doesn't really have a mandate to distribute funds by formula or anything like that to each town or to each subregion per se, we do the best we can to make sure that needs are being met in each subregion and in each municipality throughout our entire region. Which is certainly one of the biggest challenges of our work, as I mentioned, and as you can tell from looking at this map, the region is quite large and quite diverse, but we do the best we can to make sure everyone's needs are being met. And you can see on this slide here that on the whole, funding over the 5-year TIP actually tracks fairly closely with these other key metrics by each subregion. And so we've compared in the red bars here, the amount of funding in this year's TIP to other key metrics like the percent of jobs, the percent of population, and the percent of federal aid roadway miles in each of our subregions to sort of do, again, a snapshot in time check of how we're distributing funding across the region. Just a couple of notes here. You'll notice that the NSPC, or North Suburban Planning Council, their funding is a little bit higher than their sort of comparable metrics. And this is because they had 2 projects added to the TIP this year, a project in Woburn and a project in Burlington. And so because those 2 projects have been added, that boosted their funding. And so these things do tend to fluctuate, again, year over year, sort of by, you know, what's in the first year of the TIP that's come out, or what's in the last year of TIP that's added. And I guess of similar notes, Metro West, or MWRTA, on here had a pretty large project that's programmed in 2020 that is no longer included in the 5-year time band of the TIP because this TIP is 2021 through 2025. And so that's why their funding looks relatively low here. But of course, that's just sort of a function of where we are in this 5-year period, and doesn't really reflect that they're sort of underfunded in the long run. And I don't have the chart with me today, but if you were to look at this over a longer period of time, you would see that, you know, over the last 10 to 15 years, funding has been distributed pretty evenly across the region relative to these other metrics. So this is an infographic that summarizes a lot of the key takeaways from this year's TIP. It's sort of a useful way to think about all of the investments that we're making and the impacts that they have on the transportation system. So again, we programmed 47 projects in 37 municipalities in our region, which is more than 1/3 of the cities and towns that we govern at the MPO. We also, in making decisions, think about projects in terms of how they impact our performance measures for the transportation system. And so here you can see that we're funding projects that do everything from addressing safety at high crash locations and adding new sidewalks to fixing structurally deficient bridges and reducing carbon dioxide emissions. So when we think about funding projects, we really take into account the extent to which any given project will help us make progress on metrics like the ones you see outlined in this infographic. And we have scoring criteria that we apply to each project to measure the extent to which any given project will address these metrics and these performance measures. So I want to talk specifically, to wrap up here, about the specific projects that we've added using regional target dollars, or MPO specific funds in this year's TIP. So we, in allocating our funding in 2025, our board chose to program just the single highest scoring project in our complete streets, intersection improvements, and bicycle and pedestrian categories. And these are the highest scoring using, as I just mentioned, our scoring criteria. And so you see here, we funded in the complete streets category improvements around Woburn Common. In our intersection improvements category, we're funding improvements at the intersection of Route 3 and Bedford Road in Burlington and Woburn. And then finally, we also funded another section of the Independence Greenway in Peabody under our bicycle and pedestrian program. So normally the MPO would fund more projects than just this, but many of the projects that we had already committed to funding in earlier years of the TIP, so that's 2021 through 2024, had significant cost increases this year, which led there to being a very limited amount of funding available for new projects. And I'll come back to this theme again here in a minute. As I mentioned earlier, we also funded projects through our Community Connections program in 2021. And this is, again, our first time doing this, our pilot round of this program. But we were able to fund 5 projects for a total of $822,000. And those projects are listed here. It's an expansion of a microtransit service in Newton, improvements to signals around the busway in Davis Square. We also funded a transit signal priority project on Concord Avenue in Cambridge. We funded the installation of some protected bike shelters at the Concord commuter rail station, adjacent to the Bruce Freeman Rails Rail. And then finally, we're allocating some funding to support a marketing budget for a carpool program in Sharon that aims to connect commuters with the commuter rail station there in Sharon. And again, as I mentioned before, we have set aside $5.5 million for our transit modernization program in 2025. And we'll come back to allocating these funds to specific projects in future TIP cycles. Just a couple of other notes, sort of wrap up the decisions that were made this year, and then we will open it up to a discussion. So as I mentioned earlier, we had a lot of cost increases this year for projects that we had already committed to funding in federal fiscal years 2021 through 2024. And those cost increases really ate up a lot of the new funding that we had this year. And so 31 of the 47 projects that we have in the TIP had cost increases. So about 2/3 of the projects that we funded. And 19 of these projects had cost increases for more than $1 million a piece. And so those add up very quickly. And again, put us in a pretty constrained position to fund new projects, unfortunately. We also, sort of in doing that, the TIP has to be fiscally constrained in every year. And so when costs go up for a certain project, that leads to other projects being bumped into a later year. And so 13 projects out of the 47 in the TIP this year actually had to be delayed to later years. It's certainly not an ideal outcome, but it's just sort of the nature of what happens with limited funding in any given year, and cost increases by different projects. And I will say right now that it is MPO policy to cover cost increases for projects that we've already committed to funding. We really, once we choose to fund a project, we really do want to see it through to completion. And so we do the best we can to try to cover any cost adjustments for any given project, as well as any schedule changes for projects. And sort of as a result of all these dynamics, we did end up moving some funding for a couple of different projects over multiple years, splitting that up to help balance our budgets. So you'll see some of that if you compare last year's TIP to this year's, that we've split some projects over multiple years. A couple other quick notes and then we'll wrap up. So I did want to flag, given the earlier emphasis that I said that we place on equity, that we've actually emphasized equity more in our physical TIP reports this year. So there's a new chapter, chapter 6, which covers the way that we think about equity and capital planning in the region. So if you haven't already checked out our report, it's on our website, and I encourage you to specifically take a look at the good work we're doing there. So as many of you probably know, we're in the middle of the public comment period for this year's TIP. So the comment period began last Friday and will run through May 21st at 5 p.m. While we're having this conversation, we certainly encourage you to submit other comments as well if you have things that you'd like to specifically get back to the board. So all the comments we receive on the TIP will go back to the MPO for their consideration before they actually vote to approve the final document. We do have a project database that is almost updated. We are in the home stretch of getting all of the projects in this year's TIP into that database. So hopefully by the end of the day tomorrow, you'll be able to jump in there and check out in more detail all of the projects that are in this year's TIP. And then we are doing some other work that's very much related to all of this, and that we are revising the scoring criteria that we use to make investment decisions. This work has been ongoing since last fall and will wrap up by September of this year. So we encourage you to keep in touch with us and keep track of that work and weigh in on it as appropriate. So again, here's all our contact information, and we can send this out in an email afterwards so you know how to get in touch with us. Yeah, I don't know, Rasheen, I don't know if you want to cover any of the final sort of upcoming things, but feel free to.
Yeah, sure. So here are a few other events that we have coming up soon. So on Tuesday, we're doing, in partnership with MAPC, we're doing a COVID response forum specifically for transportation providers and specifically focusing on smaller providers. So sort of anything smaller than an RTA. So that would be your TMAs, your council on aging bands, your municipal shuttles, even down to like volunteer driver programs. We've basically been hearing a lot from stakeholders that they need a place to talk to each other and try and talk about what their response has been like and the challenges they've been facing during the pandemic. So hopefully this is a forum for them to do that. It is open to the public. Anyone's welcome to come, but we are trying to prioritize the voices of providers just so that they have that space to collaborate. And then we're doing another TIP virtual open house on the 18th. And then we are hosting for the MPO chair for MassDOT a virtual meeting that they're doing for their CIP. And that'll be on the 21st. And here are some ways you can reach us. So we're on the web, bostonmpO.org, and that's sort of like home base for pretty much everything: meeting calendar, agendas, public notices. You can submit official comment through our feedback form. You can take a look at our blog, Trans Report. You can subscribe to our mailing list. And then we're also on pretty much all the socials at Boston Region MPO. So Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, LinkedIn, we're all over the place. And pretty much all those socials, if you comment, you'll be talking to me. So just know that someone is paying attention. There's a person behind that account. Yeah, that is how you can get in touch with us.
Awesome. Thanks, Rasheen. And yeah, sort of on that note, given Rashid's comments about there are real people on the other side of this, we very much want this to be more of a conversation and a dialogue. So yeah, we can definitely open it up to any questions, comments that you all might have about the TIP process or projects that are funded or how all this stuff works, or just generally about the MPO. And again, we've got 5 staff members here on the call who can collectively support answers to your questions, or if you'd just like to make a comment, we're happy to do that as well. So I'd encourage folks to use the raise hand function again if you do have a question or comment. And yeah, I mean, we're sort of anything and everything is fair game. So we want to make sure that you have all of your concerns addressed and that you have a good sense of sort of, what's in the TIP and the ways we make investment choices. So feel free to, to jump in, and I will open this back up to be a little bit more dialogue friendly. Yeah.
And if anyone's new to this, just a quick reminder, the raise hand function is just in the bottom of your participants list.
Weren't we joking about what we were going to do if nobody had questions?
Yeah, sure, you know.
Card tricks.
Yeah. While we're working on our stand-up material, I might test it out here. Yeah, and I will say, you know, if folks are sort of, that is obviously a lot of information, so if folks are unsure of their questions at this point, we are always accessible via, you know, any of our contact information, you know, after this meeting, not just over the next couple of weeks during the public comment period for the tip, but at any time. And that is something that we do really want to, that we do take pride in a lot as staff, is being accessible. Yeah, so comments and questions don't have to come in today, but we're happy to take them. It looks like we do have some comments here, or comment or question. So Walter, I'll start with you. I'll go ahead and unmute you. Ooh, sorry.
Hey, thanks for inviting me. I'm with the PBD Independence Greenway, and I look forward to seeing what goes on with that project that we're building from the extension down into Salem. And I appreciate you guys inviting me to this meeting.
Yeah, definitely. Obviously, thank you for being here. And yeah, just, you know, for folks, so the Independence Greenway is, I think, something that we're all excited about at the MPO, because we've been able to fund in consecutive years 2 different sections of that trail system, and so yeah, so it's sort of a nice way for us to use our decisions sort of year over year to you know, help build out a bicycle and pedestrian network for the whole region, and sort of connect, you know, be able to connect some of these existing trail systems that may have gaps. And so the Independence Greenway is one that we're excited about, because both of these projects really serve to connect and enhance trails that are already there.
Yeah. Well, thanks again for inviting me. I look forward to also seeing the bridge built over Route 1.
Yeah. Yeah.
One of my dreams.
Yeah. Yeah, which is for folks, that's a part of the segment of the Independence Greenway that we've funded in 2025, has a bridge over Route 1, which connects to, again, like some other sections of the Independence Greenway, and yeah, helps connect to some of the local parks and stuff as well.
Also, can you elaborate a little bit more about whether we're going to get funding to connect with Wakefield and Linfield?
Yeah, that's a good question. I know MassDOT has done some state-funded work on the Wakefield Linfield rail trail. They have a segment of that included, I think it's in 2022. Trying to remember off the top of my head, but there is a segment of that that's funded by MassDOT, and so they're, you know, sort of doing their part to help with the larger trail system on the North Shore. Yeah, and I'm not sure, I guess, about other segments beyond that, but I do know that MassDOT has that segment funded.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, my basic speech was when we did a bike ride last year with the Fall for PBD festival about connectivity with all of the surrounding towns. PBD seems to be right in the middle of everything. And, you know, going forward, we need to make that connectivity vision happen.
Absolutely. Yeah, appreciate you bringing that one up. And I could pull up, let's see. Yeah, so we could do a quick screen share again. for folks. So this is the segment of the new segment of the Independence Greenway that we funded this year. This is from the actual report. As you can see here, that it connects to some existing segments of the Independence Greenway, which are sort of on the right and left side of this this image, and the bridge over Route 1, and then yeah, I believe this is the Border to Boston Trail further north.
Yeah.
So we really see this project as a great way to make this missing link between 3 existing trail segments. Which is very exciting. And then we've also funded this other segment in 2024, so 1 year earlier, that is further east of that second segment. And this connects to the mall and things. Yeah, so we're really excited about this project. We definitely appreciate you being on this call.
Thanks again.
Yeah, thank you. Does anyone else have questions or comments? It's like WIG. Yeah. Oh. So I think. So WIG, it looked like you had a hand raised. I don't know. I see that you're on the phone, so maybe it's just an issue with the hand raising on the phone. But I'm going to go ahead and unmute you, see if you've got a comment.
Great. Terrific. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. So I'm Wig Zamor from Somerville. Know a couple of you, but I haven't been attending MPO meetings too much. So hopefully, I've lost some of my notoriety. So a couple. I just want to make a couple comments on Clean Air Act, and then I had a couple questions that maybe you can help with, since I've not been as connected as I'd love to be. I always think that when you're talking about the history of surface transportation planning, that you probably should include the 1970 Clean Air Act, because that's the basis of transportation conformity regulations in the United States. And you know, it's not as big an issue now, but it was a pretty big issue all across the U.S. when that first Clean Air Act with teeth was passed, and it was tied to all the transportation funding, surface funding in the United States. And I think that was, you know, part and parcel of the cessation of highway building back under Sargent. That was when kind of the Clean Air Act was getting its legs. And just want to comment, I don't want to pick a bone about it, but I-93 was completed through Somerville after that, against the overview of the Clean Air Act, notwithstanding some pretty strong studies about the effect of lead on children in Chelsea and Somerville. And just for information, this doesn't have to be part of any case, but in any presentation, but the key lawsuit was actually the South Terminal case, which was about a garage at Logan Airport. And Massport argued that the worst air measurements in the state were actually in Wellington Circle. And Massport asked for them to be thrown out of federal court because they showed such high air pollution that Massport said they couldn't be considered to be real. But they were real, and that's what that whole case turned on, that set the transportation conformity and surface transportation planning from that point on in eastern Massachusetts. So just wanted to make that note. And more recently, you know, the Green Line was long to Somerville, which we're so appreciative of, just as you said, was for a very long time, for decades, was the largest Clean Air Act mitigation in Massachusetts submissions to federal government for conformity review, and it just kept getting bumped. And finally, we put the state on transportation conformity probation, on federal probation, and the state came within a couple months of losing $1 billion cash a year of federal money. And Aloisi was kind enough live in an MPO meeting to kind of turn on a dime. It was probably going to happen anyway, but I asked him a polite question in the middle of a visit of the secretary to the Boston MPO if they shouldn't put the green line back on, and he just turned on a dime and asked the MPO staff to do that and the board to do that. And ever since then, it's stayed on track, and we're really grateful for that. The other thing I wanted to say about the Clean Air Act on the other end of local impact is, of course, climate, which you've brought up. And the T does burn 20 million gallons of diesel a year, and Logan burns 20 million gallons on the tarmac and 20 million in the first 3,000 feet. But we don't count black carbon as a climate pollutant. And, anybody who's doing it from a science basis or looking at ICPP protocol knows that black carbon has 3,200 times the impact of CO2 on a per unit of mass basis on a 20-year global warming potential analysis. So that lack, I think people who really don't understand the science or try to conform with it see the word greenhouse gas, and others, the international community and certainly state of California, has switched to using the term climate pollutant because they're not all gases. And that 3,200 times the potency of CO2 is a massive contributor. And it's a short-lived climate pollutant, even though it's a 20-year analysis. And what that means is that if you focus on reducing black carbon emissions, you get a really quick payback. You get really quick advance on your climate concerns as a state and as a region that the MPO looks at. So, I just want to make that point. We don't need to argue about it or anything. But I bring this up, and it's pretty clear. It's not debated. The scientists don't debate this anymore. Then to kind of move toward questions, the first one's an easy one for you guys. How many TAZs are there now? Have they changed at all in the last 15 or 20 years? I know they got tripled about 15 years ago, but I think they've stuck there ever since. Do you know the TAZ count in Scott's, all the model groups?
I don't off the top of my head. Yeah.
Well, that's okay. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I believe it's around 2,000.
I
think it's 2707,
Okay.
unless it's changed. And it's roughly 3 times as granular as the census tracts. There's a slightly different geometry and geography, but the MPO technical staff are really good at mapping that. And I think it's important to look at the TAZs from time to time because that's where the local equity issues are for transportation. When people talk about the relationship of COVID-19 to air pollution in Chelsea or the air pollution in the highway corridors in Somerville, that kind of thing, that's really not driven by regional PM 2.5, and it's certainly not driven by ozone, which is low in corridors with high primary emissions from transportation, because ozone is scavenged right away along highway corridors or around Logan. There's virtually no ozone because it's taken by the NO to convert up to NO2. But that TAZ data, and I know Scott is a little careful that people don't over imbue it with accuracy on a one-by-one basis. But it's really good data on the populations and the equity and the emissions and the travel. So I think there's some utility that could be gotten there with you guys working with MAPC and maybe some of the science community. But
hey,
thank
Wig?
you for, yeah.
Wait, sorry, this is Betsy Harvey.
Yeah, please, yeah.
Circle back. Hi, how are you?
Good.
I want to circle back to your question about the TAZs. In our MPO region specifically, there are 1,901 TAZs. But that's just the MPO region. The model does the entire state, as well as, since it's been transformed from a regional model to a statewide model.
Okay.
So it covers the state plus some TAZs in New Hampshire and some in all of Rhode Island.
Okay.
MPO itself is 1,901 TAZs.
Okay, so it sounds like they're a little bigger. I mean, it always had a buffer because you had to do the buffer analysis of trips in and out, but it wasn't the whole state before. So, that's great. And I know when you did that last really detailed personal travel model that you did it for the whole state, which was a great thing to do given your capacity. But thank you for that, and I'll try to catch up on it. But I was just curious because I'm so out of date. I did want to bring up two things about one thing about the Green Line corridor, and then one thing about the regional bike paths, which I'm so glad that we're moving ahead with those, even though I'm not a bike commuter, and glad to see Walter there. It's just a spectacular thing for health and opportunity for everybody, really. When the paths are wide enough, they can be used for so many different people for so many purposes. And Somerville has had enormous benefit from the community path, and that's one of the big benefits of the Green Line, that the path unification, at least from Bedford, Lexington to downtown, is going to happen. But so in connection with actually there are two path questions, but there's been a lot of talk at Assembly Square across from the casino about getting the Northern Strand path down from Lynn, which is one of those really important regional connections. And they're pretty far along with the bridge over to Assembly, which would make that path, the casino, but many, many other people be able to use that Assembly Orange Line station, which we would love to see happen. That was the first subway stop built in 30 years. It was built without any T money, and the more utility we can get out of it, not just for Somerville, but for the region, the better. And connecting active transport to electrified transit is as sustainable as you can get, notwithstanding the current health crisis we're in. So I understand that there's a gap, not on the bridge funding, which is pretty big, but on just the connection on the Draw 7 side of that station. And, when we got that station done as part of the Assembly Square settlement years ago, we didn't want it gold-plated, and it's not heated, which it probably should be, but there's got to be an easy way to just get a connection up to the main head house from the Draw 7 side. And so any suggestions, even if it's not MPO funding, any suggestions that you would have to toss out to us that we could help make that last connection for that Northern Strand path, we'd be happy to support that from the Somerville side of the river to get that done. The north side of Boston is not connected to the modern economy. The Red Line connects Longwood Medical and Harvard Allston and Boston and Cambridge, but the Blue Line communities are left out of the urban economy. And as it moves from getting revolutionary, the knowledge economy and information and bio, to getting evolutionary, there's no reason we can't ship those evolutionary jobs out to the gateway cities on electrified transit in all directions, and certainly getting them north to Lynn or to Everett or to Logan East Boston or to Chelsea ought to be a first order goal in the long run. We've got that Grand Junction corridor, which is just sitting there and only used for occasional transport. And that really is a hugely underutilized asset. So I just wanted to mention that, but with specifically that little connection to the Assembly Square head house, if you guys think of something that could be done with that, even if it's not MPO funding, just let us know, and we'll show up. And the last question I have is about the Green Line corridor itself. We're delighted that John Dalton and the design build team are proceeding economically and expeditiously with that. And it's going to be done pretty much on time and on budget. And, nobody complained when the bridges were down, and they're still down for a few more months, and we're going to get bussed again from Leechmere. But really, there's a lot of people here happy to suck it up for long-term benefit, and that's what we're going to do. But there is no plan to regreen that that corridor, all the hillsides that were cut. There were thousands of trees cut. And it just, I get that big trees are a threat to rail corridors. But, you know, there's a MIPA regulation that if you cut 10 street trees over 14 inches, you have to do a MIPA filing. There is no equivalent for transit-dependent communities. And these were tens of thousands of trees, including hundreds of big caliber trees. And they got not even a hand wave. And, you know, I've put a couple, I'm not on the GLX community committee, and I try to stay off of things that other people are representing because the more participants, the better. But we're going to need some way to figure out to regreen that corridor a little bit. And I have spent a couple weekends going to the D line between Fenway and Longwood in the Emerald Necklace, which is all 100-foot trees right next to the Green Line tracks on both sides. And that is one of the wealthiest communities in Massachusetts. There is not a chance in heck that that corridor is going to be stripped of those big trees. And then I come back, and across from me, literally across the street from me, the triple-deckers used to have 70 feet of tree cover across them that overlooked the Green Line corridor, and now they have 0 tree cover. And the stark difference between the bare corridor and the bare ground in Somerville and that treed, unbelievably treed corridor in Brookline and Longwood Medical and Fenway is just stunning. And, you know, even if it's not part of the Green Line funding, the GLX funding, just an opportunity for the community to work with landscape designers around here and to invite the MPO and the T to participate on some kind of sustainable green solution, whatever it would be, compatible with both the transit but also with the neighborhood. Somerville has the least green space in the state per 1,000 residents, a little less than Chelsea, and the densest population in the state, a little more than Chelsea. And having that bare corridor, which is our largest former green corridor, and having an ability to regreen it with natural planting and some pollinators and stuff like that, just things that people would enjoy along the bike path and the community path, would be terrific. So I just wanted to throw those out kind of as long-term questions, not as challenges for today, but just to ask for some cooperation if we figure out how to transition from John Dalton's crew kind of buttoning up the project to a longer-term way of greening those corridors in some way that's appropriate for both the abutters, the passive and the active travelers on the path, and the T itself. So I'll stop. Thank you for giving me the opportunity. I'm happy to have reactions now, but I'm happy to have an email or, you know, I'm in your building all the time. We have three rock T oversight meetings a month, and I've moved the Massport Oversight Committee to 10 Park Plaza because I think they should be in the same building instead of at Logan. So I'm there for that too. It's nice to see you guys.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for weighing in. Certainly, you've raised like a lot of really good issues, and you know, I think the last two sort of comments and questions that you posed around both the connection to Assembly Station and you know the greening of the corridor along the Green Line extension, you know, I think are both certainly opportunities that I think the MPO would be interested in looking at, even, you know, with something like regional target funds. I think the challenge for us, you know, just as an agency is that we aren't a project initiation body. And so those,
right.
If there were projects to make an impact in either of those ways, they would have to be led by Somerville or by another proponent.
Yep.
Sort of brought to us. But, you know, I think especially given, you know, the financial commitment we've made to both of those areas, Assembly and the Green Line extension,
yep.
in past funding cycles, you know, I mean, I know the MPO as a body certainly wants to see, you know, those projects in those areas be successful. It's just a matter of, you know, basically closing that gap between, you know, the resources that we may have to consider, you know, bringing to bear on some of these issues versus like the actual, you know, creation of a project for us to
Right, and you know, we'd have to. It would take a couple steps. We would have to start with some broad-minded planning and, you know, participatory planning and workshops and things, and it wouldn't be one big line item up front. It would be a couple steps, which could be fun for people. Somerville is pretty game to, you know, to try things for regional benefit as well as local benefit. So, you know, and this the first long conversation about it happened at the Rider Oversight Committee because they've resumed the 3 meetings a month now on Zoom, and you know, I try not to be too much of a local advocate on the Rider Oversight Committee or the Massport Oversight Committee, but it's bubbling up locally a little bit, and it's bubbled up there a little bit. So I just wanted to raise it and appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Greg. We definitely appreciate you being here and weighing in. Excuse me. And yeah, for other folks, as Kate mentioned in the chat, if anyone arrived late and didn't hear some of the instructions, if you have questions or comments, feel free to use the raise hand function in the participant window in Zoom. We can do our best to address them. And yeah, so happy to give folks a little bit more time to raise questions or concerns if anyone has them. And then again, I'll just, you know, reiterate the message that we shared earlier, which is that, you know, you're always welcome to follow up with us via email or phone or anything like that, you know, after the meeting if you think of things later, or you know, if you'd like us to weigh in on more specific questions or anything like that you'd rather raise in another forum. So open to all forms of communication.
Yeah, and just to add to what Matt said is we'll send around after this event a bunch of the materials that he referenced today, such as the draft tip, links to our websites, as well as all our contact information. And so if you'd like to submit a formal comment, you know, we'll have our comment form available, as well as you can email Matt or any of our staff. So we'll just make sure all of you have that after this event. And we'll shamelessly plug all our social media as well, where you can get up-to-date information along with our email list. So if you go follow at Boston Region MPO, again, like Roisin said, we're on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube, and LinkedIn. I think I got them all.
Hey, Matt, I know it's not totally updated yet, but maybe did you want to do like a very short demo of the database just to show people where it's at and what it looks like if they're interested in checking it out once it is updated?
Definitely. Yeah, thanks, Roisin. Yeah, so we are sort of in the process of finalizing an update to this, which, you know, we hope is not only a resource if you want to make public comments or just review this year's draft tip. We are very much in a sort of longer term process of, you know, building out this database. So it's something that we launched about a year ago, and we've, you know, continued to try to build it out. Yeah, so the hope is it becomes not only a resource for current, you know, for the current tip, but also for, you know, historical tip information, all that. So yeah, so more to come in the coming, you know, months on that, but I can definitely give you a quick tour. Let's see, I'll do a quick screen share so you can see where it is on our website and all that. So let's see. Okay. So yeah, so this is the homepage of our website. And if you go to Information Center here and then Interactive Applications, you can scroll down. Third on the list is Transportation Improvement Program projects. And so again, this contains the information for last year's tips. So all of this will be slightly updated here in the next day or so. But the sort of meat and potatoes of this is the search for projects tab. And this includes all of the roadway projects in the entire region that are funded both by the MPO, but also by our partners at MassDOT. And so it's a pretty comprehensive list. I mean, you can see, projects very much scatter the whole region. And if you scroll down, you can see just some basic information about what's in here, sort of when is the first year that they're programmed and how much are they programmed for, and sort of, where and what and all these things. And then, the most exciting part of this, we can use, let's find a good example here. Let's see. Let's do, looking for, okay. Let's do like a project on, it's a project on Beecham Street in Everett. And so this is one that we programmed in the tip last year for the first time. And, you can see it comes up with a project map that's interactive. So it gives you a sense of where the project is. This is just a Google Maps interface, so it's pretty easy to navigate around. And then below down here is like all the information we have on the project. This really gives you some insight. I mentioned a couple of times the criteria that we use to score projects, and that score becomes like a big part of how decisions are made by the board. This is sort of broken down by tab here, by scoring area. So you can see like when it comes to safety, you can see like all of the data that we use to score the project. And then you can see, what the actual score is for each, goal or each criterion. And so it's really, we're trying to be sort of as clear and transparent as possible about what we look at when we think about programming a project. So there's quite a bit of detail in here. The project overview tab gives you, sort of basic description, some of the general characteristics of the project. So there's quite a bit here. And again, this will be updated to reflect all of the projects that are in the 2021 through 25 tip. So, please feel free to use this as a resource. I guess I'll just say, generally, we hope this is sort of valuable information. And we're always open to suggestions on ways to improve it. So if you have thoughts on things that would be helpful to see in there, please don't hesitate to let us know, because we're always looking to make sure that we're clear on the decisions we're making and how we're going about that. So definitely check that resource out. And again, it should be updated in the next couple of days at the latest. So thanks Roisin for bringing that up. I know we're scheduled until 6, but we can also let folks go a little bit early if there are no other questions or comments. But we definitely want to make sure that everyone, sort of had their voices heard. So we'll do this as sort of a quick last call for questions or comments if folks have them. And if not, just on behalf of all the staff and on behalf of the MPO board, we just want to say thank you for your time and your feedback. Especially during this highly unusual moment. I guess one of the things that we're excited about is that, placing more of an emphasis on digital platforms has allowed us to do more things like this, which is great. And so we certainly hope to continue this in the coming weeks and months. As Kate mentioned earlier, we do have some MPO meetings coming up. The next one is next Thursday, May 14th at 10 a.m. And you can join that meeting via Zoom as well and listen in. And you're obviously welcome to participate in that conversation in the same way that you participated here. And then I guess in terms of next steps on the actual TIP process, again, we'll be taking formal public comments on that through May 21st. And then on May 28th at that MPO meeting, May 28th at 10 a.m., we will reconvene with the MPO board and present any public comments to them. And then after discussion and any sort of addressing of comments and concerns, we hope the board will vote to approve the 5-year plan. So, so sort of where we're going from here. And
just to add a couple more things, Matt, just some questions that we got in the chat is we'll definitely make available the whole contact list of all the staff that joined us from the open house today. We'll also be, sorry for this sun that's in my eyes, but we'll be sharing a survey. This is, our first of our couple virtual open houses, and we're really welcome to any feedback and tips for improvement of things that you think people would benefit from. So we'd love if you could take the time to fill out our survey, but in the follow-up email, we'll have, again, the draft tip, the survey, all the contact information, the upcoming events that we're offering, as well as ways to check out our meeting calendar and social media channels to get up-to-date information about upcoming MPO meetings and other events. So if anyone has any questions about that, I'm happy to help and answer that too. But I also want to reiterate Matt's thank you. We're so grateful that all of you joined us this evening to learn more about the tip and ask your questions. We really appreciate learning this as well in our process of getting to engage with people virtually during this time.
yeah, awesome. Thanks, Kate. Yeah, with that, I guess we'll let folks go a few minutes early, but thanks again. Yeah, and if you know other people who are interested in this who couldn't make it today, please let them know that we're doing another open house, here in about 10 days, and again, we'll follow up with that information after this. So please feel free to forward that to anyone who may want to join. But in the meantime, thank you all, and yeah. Enjoy the rest of your, this beautiful sunny Thursday.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for coming, folks.